Hi everyone and welcome back. In today's video, we are going to discuss about an important topic specifically from the production environment perspective, which is the pod security standard. So let's get started. So many a times it has been observed that in production environments, users will go ahead and launch privileged pods even when they are not required. And when you have privileged pods that are running that has so many capabilities, and if these pods get compromised, then it will make the life of attacker simpler because the privileged pods already has so many capabilities, so it becomes easier to break into the system. For example, let's say that you have a production namespace. So you will launch pod 1, maybe at a later stage someone might go ahead and launch pod 2 which has privileged as true. Then you will have pod 3. Now although pod 1 and pod 3 are not really created with lot of options, but the pod 2 over here has a privilege of true. So this is ideally something that you do not really want. Many times there are genuine requirements where privileged pods or pods with a little insecure configurations are required. So in such case it is fine, but if it is not required and still you go ahead and launch pods with a lot of capabilities, this is something that should ideally be avoided. Now, in many of the bigger organizations, you will see that security team would had set the standards for production related namespaces specifically. So you have some security standards like containers must not run as a root user, or host path volume must not be used, or no privileged containers should be deployed in the production environments, and so on. Now, the issue here is that these are primarily the standards and act as an advisory. So it is not 100% enforced. So although there will be a documentation where security team will create a template that whatever pods deployments that you create, make sure that all of these pointers are followed. But if a user decides to go ahead and still launch the privileged pods, then that enforcement is something that is not implemented. So what you would ideally want in a production environment is that any attempt to circumvent the security standards that have been set, those attempts should be blocked immediately. So let's assume that you have a production namespace over here. So this production namespace, we want it to be secured. Now, based on what pointer you want it to be secured? You want it to be secured based on certain security standards. So once there is a security layer around it, now what will happen is even if the user goes ahead and tries to launch a privileged pod on a production namespace, even when the security team has said no, then this kind of attempts will automatically be blocked. Now this specific part that we are discussing is achieved using a feature of pod security standards in Kubernetes. So at a very high level overview, pod security standards are a set of guidelines that are established by the Kubernetes to ensure that whatever pods that are running in a specific namespace, it meets the security requirements. Now, these set of security requirements are being defined by Kubernetes itself, so you don't really have to manually define the security requirements. We'll be discussing on what exactly are these requirements that are being set. So ultimately, pod security standard that we are discussing, it is something similar to the security standards that you see over here. Again, it is quite more extensive, but whatever pod that tries to get scheduled, it will be verified against the security standard and also the pod security policy that is being set. And based on that, it will be either allowed or blocked. So when we discuss about this pod security standard check, in total, this check is based on 3 important policies. And based on this, either the pod will be allowed or it will not be allowed. Alright. So these 3 policies that we are discussing, these are defined and created by the Kubernetes itself. And these policies range from highly permissive to highly restrictive. So at an overview, when we discuss about 3 policies, one is the privileged policy. It is more of an unrestricted policy. Then you have the baseline policy, and then you have a much more secure policy called as restricted policy. First, let's go ahead and explore all of them, post which we'll have a demo that will allow us to understand this in a better terms. Now the first policy is the privileged policy. Now privileged policy is purposely open and entirely restricted. So here there is no restriction that takes place, and it is also defined by absence of restrictions. So if you want to create privileged pods, if you want to create any kind of pod with a lot of security related misconfigurations, the privileged policy will allow it. So this is one point to note. So it is a pretty chill policy. Now, the second policy, which is more restrictive when compared to the privileged policy, is the baseline policy. Now, the aim of the baseline policy is to make sure that the adoption is easy for most of the common workloads. Now, although it will not allow known privileged escalations, but apart from that, it is not too strict. Alright, and this is the reason why the baseline policy is generally targeted at applications that are non-critical in nature. So some of the operations that are not allowed when you have a baseline policy in place, like privileged pods are not allowed, host path volumes are not allowed, and few others. Now, the most strict policy among all of them is the restricted policy. At a high level overview, when you discuss about restricted policy, it is aimed at enforcing the current pod hardening best practices. Now, when you enforce this, it comes with a cost. The cost is compatibility. So it is not ensured that all of the applications that you run directly through a manifest file, all of them will be created when this policy is enforced. So you will have to modify the manifest file for your applications to ensure that it conforms to the restricted policy and the guidelines that are being set. So generally, this policy is more targeted towards the security critical applications as well as in an environment where you have a lower trust users. Now, when we discuss about restricted policies, it includes everything from the baseline policy. In addition to that, there are wide range of other restrictions that are applied, like containers must be required to run as a non-root users, or SecOp profile must explicitly set to one of the allowed values that is part of the policy, and so on. These are some simple examples. There are extensive set of examples that are available. Alright, so this is one point to note. Generally, when we discuss about the production environments and when you have a very critical workloads, ideally you should have the restricted policy. However, in a dev test environment, the privileged policy is quite good. It allows you to quickly get started. Now, before we proceed further, I also wanted to show you the official documentation related to the pod security standards. As we're discussing, there are three primary types of policies or profiles. One is the privileged profile, you have the baseline profile, and third is the restricted profile. As we're discussing, restricted is heavily restricted policy that follows the current pod hardening best practice. So currently connecting to the terminal, note that this is going to be a demo video. We are going to have a separate practical video associated with the pod security standards. First, let us understand this at an overview, then we'll be discussing practically in detail. Now for today's demo, I have three namespaces that are available. One is the baseline namespace, then you have the privileged namespace, and then you have the restricted namespace. Similar to the three profiles that we were discussing, baseline namespace has the baseline profile, privileged namespace has the privileged profile, restricted namespace has the restricted profile. First, let's go ahead and try creating a privileged pod in the namespace of privileged. Alright, so let's say kubectl run privilege pod. I'll say image equals to nginx and I'll just add a privilege flag over here. And the namespace is privileged namespace over here. Let's also fix this typo. Now, when you go ahead and launch a privileged pod in a privileged namespace, it is working. As we're discussing, privileged namespace is more of a chill namespace because the profile that is being applied over here does not really have restrictions. Now, when you try to launch this pod in a different namespace, let's say baseline namespace, immediately here you see we are getting an error. What does it states? That this specific pod is forbidden. It violates the pod security, which is the baseline profile, and it is also stating why, which is that security context.privileged equals to true must not be set. So ultimately, in fact, let me quickly show you. When I do a dry run equals to client with output of YAML, you will see that within here, this specific part, security context privileged as true, is been set. And this is what it is stating, that this must not be set if you want to create pod in the baseline namespace. This is one part. And restricted namespace, there is no question over here. It will not really work. So if I say restricted namespace, immediately here you see we are getting error. Now note that this error is not just related to the security context privilege equals to true, but there are other security standards that are not set. For example, this specific part is not set, then it is asking you that you should drop all of the capabilities from the container. You should go ahead and add this specific part. The second part must be set and so on. So error is not related to just one, but there are multiple areas because of which you are seeing this specific error. And if you want to launch a pod in the restricted namespace, then you'll have to fix all of them. So generally, even if you try to create a basic pod in a restrictive namespace which is not privileged. So for example, I'll try and launch a test pod with the image of Nginx, and I'll just launch it in restricted namespace. This will also not really work. Why? Because it is violating the policy of restricted. So whenever you want to go ahead and launch a pod in a restricted namespace, you have to explicitly add certain details as part of the manifest file. For example, allowed privilege escalation must be set to false. You see, it says it must be set to false. Then you have to explicitly say under the security context, you have to explicitly drop all of the capabilities. You have to specify run as non-root equals to true. You have to specify the SecComp profile and so on. And only if you have a manifest file that has all of these details, then the pod will be allowed in the restricted namespace. Now, the question that comes is, how do I know what are the things that are allowed in, say, a baseline namespace or in a restricted namespace? And the answer to this is the documentation. Now, when you look into the pod security standards documentation, let's go a bit down. It will give you the profile details associated with each. First one is the privileged. So you have the privileged policy over here. Again, as we're discussing, it is unrestricted, so you don't really have to worry about it. Then you have the baseline policy. Now in baseline policy, there are some things that are not really allowed. Like for example, privileged pods. This is something that we saw. So let's take an example. So if I go a bit down, now we are more interested in this specific part, which is the privileged container. So what it states that in a pod manifest file, there are certain restricted fields. One of the restricted fields is within the containers security context.privileged. So it must either be undefined or nil. So if you have not really specified privileged under the security context, it is fine. The pod will be allowed, or it must be false. Now, if you remember, in fact, let's clear the screen. When we did a dry run on the privileged pod, in the security context, this was explicitly set as true. So what this is saying that either you do not define it at all, that is accepted, or you set it to false. This is also accepted. But apart from these two allowed values, if you have any other value that is part of either this or this or this, the policy will block the pod creation. Alright, so I hope with this you understood the restricted field and the allowed values. In a similar way, again you have some restricted fields and you have the allowed values, restricted fields and the allowed values. Now generally when you discuss about the baseline policy, the difference here is that even when you have certain fields that are undefined, by default the policy will allow it. For example, as we're discussing, if the privileged is undefined, you have not really defined it in the manifest file, then it will be allowed as part of the policy. But when we discuss about the restricted policy, it is different. So generally, in the restricted policy over here, so the control everything from the baseline policy, and then you have the restrictions that comes into picture. For example, so let's go a bit down. I wanted to show you few things. So in capabilities, there are certain restrictions that are in place. However, the allowed values here is not undefined or false. It is explicitly stating that any list of capabilities that includes all. So you have capabilities.drop. In fact, this is something that we saw where it is explicitly asking you to go ahead and set the security context.capabilities.drop equals to all. So here it is not allowing you to have an undefined value. You must set it if you want to go ahead and create a pod in restricted namespace. Along with that, there are few other things. For example, must set security context run as non-root equals to true. The SecComp must be runtime default or local host and so on. Alright, so again, this is one part to note. Now, before we conclude, few more pointers that I wanted to show you. One question that comes is, where exactly do we define these policies? For example, let's say that we have two namespaces, production namespace and development namespace. How can I say to Kubernetes that production namespace based pods should be evaluated against the restricted policy before it gets scheduled? And development namespace pods should be evaluated against, say, baseline policy or a privileged policy. So primarily, the policies can be defined at a namespace level by itself. However, in case if you would like, there are certain customizations where you can apply it at a cluster level as well. Now, for an example, you can say that at a production namespace, I require a restricted policy, and at a development namespace, I require a privileged policy. So this gives you good amount of customization based on the namespace. You can go ahead and set the policies accordingly. So let me also quickly show you this at a high level overview. Now, generally the way in which you apply a policy at a namespace level is through labels. Now we'll be discussing this in the practical video. However, when you do a kubectl get namespace, if I do a show labels over here, you will see that at a baseline namespace, you have explicitly said that pod security should be baseline. So enforce is equal to baseline. Then for privilege namespace over here, the pod security enforce equals to privilege. So here the baseline profile will be applied, here the privileged profile will be applied, and then for the restricted namespace, you have the restricted profile that will be applied. So this is one specific part. Now in Kubernetes, there is also a specific admission controller of pod security admission, also referred to as a PSA. So this specific admission controller is the primary component that enforces the pod security standards. So whenever a pod is created, the pod security admission, it will check whether the pod manifest complies with the security policies that you have set at a namespace level, and based on that, the pod will be allowed or not. So if you look into the workflow, so a user is trying to create a pod. Now the request will go to the API server. Now API server directly will not really go ahead and create a pod. Now at a namespace, there are certain policy. For example, first one has a policy of privilege, second has a policy of baseline, third has a policy of restricted. So based on this specific policy, the decision is taken by the pod security admission controller over here. So API server will ask the PSA based on the policy will make the decision, and it will say allow or deny, and based on that the pod will be scheduled or it will be blocked. Great. So that's a very high level overview on what pod security standards are all about, and with this we'll conclude today's video.